Hello students, my today's topic is related to my previous lecture in which I discussed about functioning of female reproductive system. Previously, I told you about oogenesis and folliculogenesis, but in today's lecture I will cover the key aspects of these processes, that how these processes are controlled. Moreover, we will discuss menstrual cycle and its hormonal control. Before starting my topic, let me give you an overview of oogenesis and folliculogenesis and the major events of these processes. From previous lecture, we were able to know that oogenesis is further divided into two phases, in which one starts before birth, which allows oogonium to differentiate into primary oocytes, which were then arrested at prophase 1 of meiosis 1, even after birth, and remain arrested until puberty is reached, which is basically the start of second phase, which resumes further differentiation of primary oocytes and they differentiate into secondary oocytes, and finally into a mature ovum. At the same time, folliculogenesis is progressing with oogenesis, in which granulosa and theca cells are not only surrounding oocytes in ovary but also helping them in growth and differentiation, so that an ovum can be released and the process of fertilization can take place to start life. After an ovum is released from follicle, it became corpus luteum, which is also serving a function which I will let you know but later on in this lecture. So let's get started.
Subscribe now and press the bell icon. Never miss an update.
With today's point of focus, and that is endocrinology or hormonal control of female reproductive system. To fulfill reproductive system, its ultimate function, a suite of hormones begin preparing the uterus to receive a fertilized egg and control the development of the next ovum. Here you will meet three major organs of this system, and these organs are hypothalamus, the interior pituitary, and the ovaries. They all have endocrine secretions involved in the control of female reproduction. These organs follow some sort of hierarchy and they mimic an organizational hierarchy where a boss passes an order to its subordinates and they follow accordingly what their boss has commanded. Similarly, hormonal hierarchy works on this principle, where at the top of this we have hypothalamus, which you knew very well that it is the brat of brain and acting as a boss, whereas interior pituitary and ovaries are subordinates, which do as directed by the hypothalamus. But question is, how they communicate? You already knew the answer, yes, by hormones, which are basically chemical messengers. Hypothalamus relays its message by producing a hormone named GnRH, which is also termed as gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it takes message to interior pituitary, which is also part of brain, and it responds to message by producing two hormones that are FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, that stands for luteinizing hormone. Then at the end lower of this hierarchy we have ovaries, which reacts to follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone by producing its very well-known hormones that are, yes, estrogen and progesterone. The rate of production of these hormones is different at different phases of female monthly cycle. We are going to learn details of female monthly cycle in this lecture, and we will also be able to understand that how GnRH will change its rates. Now, you were thinking that who is producing these estrogen and progesterone? Obviously from ovaries, but my question is where it is producing from? Yes, think. If you remember granulosa and theca cells of follicles which were surrounding developing oocytes, then you can easily find its answer that basically theca and granulosa cells are responsible for producing ovarian hormones. Luteinizing hormone or LH from pituitary influencing theca cells to convert androgens into cholesterol, and then follicle stimulating hormone or FSH is telling granulosa cells to convert these androgens into estrogen. Now you have all the background information needed to understand this topic. So let's start our main topic of the day, in which we are going to learn that how hormones control physiological functions of female reproductive system. Female monthly cycle, which is commonly known as menstrual cycle, is actually made up of two cycles that interact and overlap, one happening in the ovaries and one in the uterus, which are termed as ovarian and uterine cycle respectively. The purpose of ovarian cycle is to prepare an egg to be released from the ovary and builds the lining of the uterus, whereas uterine cycle is meant for the preparation of the uterus and body to accept that fertilized egg, or to start the next cycle if pregnancy doesn't happen. Here you can see that ovarian cycle, in order to fulfill its responsibility, can be divided into follicular phase that leads to ovulation and finally ends up at luteal phase. Similarly, uterine cycle is doing its job in parallel with ovarian cycle and divides into menstrual, proliferative and secretory phase. One thing you should be notice here that the event of ovulation basically splitting apart both cycles into pre and post ovulation parts. Now it's time to go deep inside this topic and discuss its every event and phase individually with respect to hormonal control. As I already discussed, uterine cycle is divided into menstrual, proliferative and secretory phase, and now we are moving towards the inside story. At the very start of female monthly cycle, we have menstrual phase, in which the endometrial lining of the uterus starts shedding, but under the influence of hormones. This phase can last from 2 to 7 days. But the question is, what causes it to shed? Principally, progesterone concentrations decline as a result of the degradation of the corpus luteum. I think I don't need to tell you now that what is corpus luteum. One point you should understand here that estrogen is produced by follicles and corpus luteum, which is responsible for body's progesterone supply, as you know. But at the same time, some estrogen is also produced by corpus luteum in post-ovulation phase. Now coming back to the question, what causes it to shed? I think you got your answer that the decline in progesterone basically triggers the shedding of endometrium uterine lining. While the follicle and ovum are maturing, the follicle secretes hormones that prepare the uterine lining, which is also known as endometrium. It gets thicker and is well supplied with blood vessels. And this phase is called the proliferative phase because the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, becomes thicker. One thing you should notice here that endometrium is thinnest during the menstrual phase and thickens throughout the proliferative phase until ovulation occurs. What do you think? Which hormone should be responsible for this? Basically, the uterus is responding to the estrogen produced by the follicles, rebuilding the lining that was just shed during the last period or the last menstrual phase. The uterus does this to create a place where a potential fertilized egg can implant and grow, and doing all this under the influence of estrogen. After proliferative phase, we have secretory phase, which starts from ovulation until the start of the next period. Recall that ovulation divides two cycles into pre and post ovulation. So secretory phase is a post ovulation phase. It means after ovulation, as the name secretory suggests, the lining of uterus start producing and secreting chemicals that will either help an early pregnancy if an egg was fertilized, or help the lining break down and shed if pregnancy or no egg was fertilized. In the uterus, progesterone is secreted from the corpus luteum, begins the secretory phase in which the endometrial lining prepares for implantation. But before moving on, what is progesterone doing here? Okay, we know that progesterone is starting this phase, but how? As now corpus luteum is formed, so we have supplies of progesterone and somehow, to some extent, estrogen as well. So I was explaining you that what is the role of progesterone here? Significantly, rising levels of progesterone cause the endometrium to stop thickening and to start preparing for the potential attachment of a fertilized egg. And if fertilization doesn't occur, or for any other reason a blastocyst future embryo fails to implant within the endometrium, the built-up endometrial lining degenerates and is shed. Here it is clearly visible that progesterone level is at its peak, causing marked swelling and secretory development of the endometrium to start preparing for the potential attachment of a fertilized egg. If you notice here, estrogen's level is also high. Why estrogen is high in this phase? Because high estrogen levels also slightly decrease the acidity of the vagina, making it more hospitable to sperm. Hormonal overview of uterine cycle presents that from day 5th of menstrual phase, estrogen starts increasing and reaches its highest during proliferative phase, and then start declines, and in secretory phase its levels start increasing again. However, progesterone marks its entry after ovulation and reaches its maximum during secretory phase. So that was the end of uterine cycle. Now let's have a look at ovarian cycle, which you already familiar with that it is divided into 3 phases: follicular phase, ovulation phase and luteal phase. Follicular phase is evident when menstrual phase is coming to an end, and proliferative phase is starting because, as mentioned earlier, both cycles are overlapping and moving parallelly. So, in follicular phase, 3 primordial follicles differentiates into primary follicles and then into secondary follicles. But focus here that only one of 3 secondary follicles is eventually selected for further differentiation into tertiary follicle, while the other 2 are dyed, which process is also known as atresia. This selected follicle is extremely important as it starts the next phase of ovarian cycle, and that is ovulation. Yes, this tertiary follicle contained or mature secondary oocyte, which then released from ovary in order to get fertilized. And that is the start of second part of ovarian cycle, that is ovulation, in which an egg is released from ovary into fallopian tube, and that process is called basically ovulation. And it divides follicular and luteal phase into pre and post ovulation phases, like it did in uterine cycle. What defines an ovulation is mainly about halfway through the cycle, on average 14 days since the last menstrual flow began, there is a measurable decrease in the woman's basal body temperature, followed by a rapid increase in temperature and in her blood level of luteinizing hormone. This LH or luteinizing hormone surge appears to be the biochemical signal for starting ovulation. How this happens? When estrogen levels are high enough, they signal to the brain, as a result of which interior pituitary causing a dramatic increase in luteinizing hormone, which is termed as a LH surge, and this spike is basically what causes ovulation to occur. Summing up the hormonal control, in which at day 5th estrogen from ovary and FSH from pituitary start rising, and near ovulation, FSH or follicle stimulating hormone starts declining. But at the same time, luteinizing hormone reaches its peak, causing LH surge. Luteal phase is basically the time between ovulation and before the start of menstruation, when the body prepares for a possible pregnancy. Once ovulation occurs, the follicle that contained the egg transforms into something called a corpus luteum and begins to produce progesterone as well as estrogen. Progesterone levels peak about halfway through this phase. Following ovulation, the follicular cells that remain in the ovary become the corpus luteum. The cells of the corpus luteum start producing steroid hormones that I already told you, progesterone and estrogen. If an egg is fertilized, progesterone from the corpus luteum supports the early pregnancy. And if fertilization and implantation are not successful, the corpus luteum begins to degenerate within 10 days of being formed. As a result of degeneration, levels of progesterone and estrogen also getting decreased, which leads towards the degeneration and shedding of endometrium, and the next menstrual flow begins. It is a very funny illustration of complete menstrual cycle, in which you can see that starting from menstrual phase, where we have low estrogen and progesterone levels, that small guy performing the character of estrogen getting bigger and bigger under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, telling the whole story of follicular phase and proliferative phases of ovarian and uterine cycles respectively, in which estrogen levels are rising and finally reaches maximum just before ovulation. Then a luteinizing hormone from brain bullying tertiary follicle to spit out an egg from the ovary termed as ovulation, and showing basically the interval of the menstrual cycle. So after interval, there is the entry of another character named corpus luteum, who is producing progesterone at very high rates until fertilization occurred. But if fertilization doesn't occur, it is dying off as corpus albicans that finally ends up at menstrual phase, which is actually not the end but the beginning of the whole story again. Another very good abstract of hormonal control of female reproductive cycle, where a comparison of ovarian and pituitary hormones is obvious. At the end, a very interesting question comes to my mind, that hormones are controlling physiological functions of menstrual cycle, but who is controlling these hormones? Have you ever listened about feedback loops which are actually controlling these hormones? They can be positive and negative feedback loops. Let's understand this concept with the help of this, in which menstrual cycle phases are described in terms of feedback loops, starting from hypothalamus, who is releasing its gonadotropin-releasing hormone or GnRH, which is positively telling pituitary to produce its hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and LH, or in short FSH and LH, and they are in turn passing orders to ovaries and uterus to produce their hormones, estradiol. Estradiol, don't worry about estradiol. Estradiol is also known as estrogen. And we know that estradiol, as granulosa cells under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, converts estradiol into estrogen. And now the high estrogen concentrations will eventually lead to a decrease in follicle stimulating hormone, resulting in atresia of all but one of the developing tertiary follicles, starting negative feedback loop and sending message to interior pituitary that stop producing more FSH and LH. Then it again switches to positive feedback, causing the elevated estrogen or estradiol production from the dominant follicle, then stimulates the LH surge that will trigger ovulation and marks the end of follicle phase. And at last, in luteal phase, positive feedback of FSH and LH continues causing corpus luteum to produce progesterone in case if pregnancy occurs. And if there is no pregnancy signs, then finally it switches back to negative feedback loop and progesterone sending negative messages that please stop producing more FSH and LH. So in this way, these hormones are controlled by negative and positive feedback loops. So that was the end of my lecture. If you like my lecture, please subscribe my channel.